December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest breathed with ice and silence. Oberst Hermann Mueller crouched in a frozen foxhole near the Belgian crossroads, watching American supply trucks crawl down the distant road. His battalion had been advancing for 36 hours, crushing through American lines that seemed to crack like frozen glass. For the first time in months, the German offensive tasted like victory. Mueller had trained his men to fear Russian rockets and British naval guns. But Americans? They were soft, poorly disciplined. Their infantry scattered easily. Their armour broke down on schedule. But as he scanned the clearing ahead, something gnawed at him, a whisper from the veteran sergeants. A rumour passed between ragged units. The Americans had something new, something no army in history had mastered. And within 90 seconds, that clearing would erupt into hell. 10 battalions, over 400 guns, firing from miles in every direction, and every shell landing in the exact same 3-second window. No warning. No ranging shots. No time to run. This wasn't artillery. It was mathematics weaponized, and it would break the faith of an entire generation of German officers who thought they understood modern war. Stay until the end to see how a stopwatch and trigonometry tables turned American artillery into the most feared weapon on the Western Front. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German army of 1944 prided itself on one cold truth. It had survived the Eastern Front, armies that could endure Stalingrad, Kursk, and the endless grinding horror of the Russian steppes, believed they had seen the worst war could offer. Soviet artillery came in massive, indiscriminate waves. Katyusha rockets screamed overhead by the hundreds. The earth shook for hours. But there was time. Time to hear the shells incoming. Time to dive into bunkers. Time to pray. German doctrine had evolved around this rhythm. When Soviet bombardments began, you went underground, counted the minutes, and emerged when the storm passed. Officers like Mueller had trained their men in this iron discipline for years. The Wehrmacht's tactical manual was clear. Artillery was area denial, not precision killing. You weathered the fire, regrouped, and counterattacked. It was brutal, but survivable. The Americans were different. Mueller had read the intelligence reports with skepticism. American gunners, the summaries claimed, could coordinate fire from batteries spread across 20 miles. They could bring shells down simultaneously without ever firing a ranging shot. Some reports even mentioned American batteries responding to calls for fire in under 3 minutes. Mueller dismissed most of it as exaggeration, propaganda designed to intimidate. After all, the Americans had only been fighting in Europe for 18 months. What could they have learned that Germany hadn't mastered in 5 years of total war? But whispers travelled faster than official reports. In field kitchens and aid stations, veterans from Normandy spoke in low voices. They described bombardments that arrived like lightning strikes, no build-up, no warning barrage. One moment the forest was silent. The next, the world exploded. Entire platoons vanished in seconds, not scattered, not suppressed, gone. Sergeant Klaus Weber, a decorated panzer grenadier who had fought from France to the Dnieper, told Mueller something that stayed with him. We feared the Russian guns because they were everywhere. We fear the American guns because they are nowhere, and then they are everywhere at once. Mueller had dismissed it as battle fatigue, but now, crouched in the frozen mud of the Ardennes with orders to seize the crossroads at Bastogne, he felt that unease again. His battalion had broken through the American lines near Schnee-Eifel with surprising ease. The green troops of the 106th Infantry Division had crumbled under the weight of German armour and veteran infantry. For 36 hours, the offensive had rolled forward with the momentum of the old days, when blitzkrieg still meant something. But something had changed in the last 6 hours. American resistance had stiffened, and the air, which should have been alive with the roar of advancing panzers, felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The kind of quiet that comes before storms. Mueller checked his watch. 0600 hours. First light. His orders were simple. cross the clearing, secure the road junction, and hold until the main armoured column arrived. Simple, direct, and exactly the kind of manoeuvre that had won Germany the war in Poland and France. He raised his hand, signalling his company commanders. 200 men rose from cover, rifles ready, boots crunching through snow. They moved in textbook formation, practiced and precise. Behind them, machine gun teams repositioned to provide covering fire. A Panzer IV idled at the tree line, its commander scanning for American armour. Mueller felt the old confidence return. This was what German soldiers did best. 15 miles to the southwest, in a cramped fire direction centre lit by kerosene lamps and cluttered with maps, American artillery officers were already calculating his death. The room smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and damp canvas. Maps covered every surface, marked with grease pencil notations and grid coordinates that changed by the minute. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartmann stood at the centre, a telephone pressed to his ear, listening to a forward observer's calm, clipped voice describe the German advance. Enemy infantry, approximately 200 strong, moving southwest across grid reference Tango 749. No armour visible yet, time of observation 0558. Hartmann didn't need to see the terrain. He had memorized every hill, every road, every clearing within 20 miles. His mind was already running calculations. Distance from Battery A, 12,000 yards. Battery C, 14,000. Battery F, 9,800. Different guns, different elevations, different charges. But with American fire direction methods, all of that could be synchronized. He turned to his fire direction officer, Captain Raymond Moore, who was already bent over a plotting board, compass in hand. "Can we mass on that grid?" Moore didn't look up. He was sliding a ruler across the map, checking overlays, calculating angles. Battery A, C, F, and H are in range. We can add the core 155s if you want real weight. Hartmann paused for only a second. "Time on target, 10 battalions. I want every gun in the sector." Moore's hand stopped. He looked up. "That's over 400 tubes, sir." Hartmann's voice didn't waver. "Then, let's not waste them. I want every shell landing within 3 seconds. No warning rounds, no adjustment, just arrival." Moore nodded once, already reaching for the field telephone that would connect him to battery commanders scattered across miles of frozen Belgian forest. This wasn't just fire support. This was a demonstration of something the German army had never encountered. American artillery had evolved beyond guns and shells. It had become a system, a machine built from radios, mathematics, and obsessive training. And it was about to prove that courage, discipline, and experience meant nothing when facing an enemy who could weaponize time itself. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the years before the war, American artillery officers had embraced a radical idea. What if artillery could be synchronized like an orchestra? Not a hammer, but a scalpel. Not suppression, but annihilation. The concept was called time on target, and it required 3 things the American military had in abundance: obsessive training, reliable communication, and a willingness to treat war like an LI, engineering problem. The theory was simple. Most casualties in an artillery barrage occurred in the first few seconds, before soldiers could react, before they could dive for cover, before fear turned into survival instinct. After that initial shock, effectiveness dropped by more than 60%. Studies conducted in the 1930s showed that once troops went prone or found cover, even sustained bombardment achieved diminishing returns. The solution was obvious, but required precision no army had yet mastered. If you could make all your shells arrive simultaneously, you maximized lethality while minimizing warning. But coordinating batteries spread across miles of terrain, each with different gun types, different ranges, and different times of flight, was a mathematical and logistical nightmare. The Germans had tried similar techniques during the First World War. Their artillery officers were masters of calculation, but German doctrine relied on centralizing fire control at a division or corps level, which meant delays. Requests for fire travelled up the chain of command, were approved, calculated, and then transmitted back down. It worked, but it was slow. The Americans decentralized everything. Every battalion had its own fire direction center. Every infantry company had forward observers trained to call in fire missions. And critically, every gun crew was trained to calculate time of flight and adjust their firing sequence so their shells arrived on target at the exact same moment as guns firing from entirely different positions. The key was the firing table, a dense book of trigonometric calculations that told gunners exactly how long a shell would take to travel a given distance at a given elevation. American crews drilled on these tables until they could run the calculations in under 2 minutes. Then they practiced firing in sequence. A battery 12 miles from the target might fire first. A battery 8 miles away would fire later. But both salvos would arrive within a 3-second window. When it worked, the effect was devastating. Targets that should have had time to seek cover were caught in the open. Entire formations were destroyed before they understood they were under attack. And because there were no ranging shots, no preliminary bombardment, the enemy never knew the strike was coming until it was too late. By 1943, American artillery units in North Africa had begun testing time-on-target missions in combat. The results impressed even skeptics. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in a letter to his wife in February 1943, noted the unnerving effectiveness of American fire coordination. An observation plane, he wrote, directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone. But Rommel's letter described only the beginning. By 1944, American artillery doctrine had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Fire direction centers could now coordinate not just multiple batteries, but entire battalions, even corps-level assets. A single forward observer, crouched in a frozen hedgerow with a radio and a map, could bring down fire from guns he had never seen, operated by men he had never met. The system worked because every piece had been standardized. Every map used the same grid system. Every radio operated on the same frequency architecture. Every gunnery crew followed the same firing procedures. It was the industrial mindset applied to warfare: interchangeable parts, reliable communication, obsessive repetition. And it turned American artillery into something no other army could match, a weapon that didn't just fire. It orchestrated. By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, American artillery battalions had perfected the technique to a degree that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Infantry divisions routinely practiced coordinating fire from 10 or more battalions, simultaneously. Corps commanders could mass the fire of over 600 tubes on a single target if the situation demanded it, and the guns themselves had improved. The M1 05mm howitzer, the backbone of American divisional artillery, was reliable, mobile, and accurate. Its maximum range of 11,000 yards meant that batteries could support infantry from positions miles behind the front lines, hidden from German observation. The M114mm howitzer, used at corps level, could reach over 14,000 yards and delivered shells that weighed 95 pounds. When used in time-on-target missions, a single volley from a battalion of 114s could obliterate an area the size of a football field. But the true innovation wasn't the guns. It was the system that made them work together. American fire direction centers operated with a speed and precision that German artillery officers found impossible to replicate. When an American forward observer called in a fire mission, the response was immediate. The fire direction officer would plot the target, determine which batteries were in range, calculate firing data for each gun, and transmit the orders, all in under 3 minutes. German artillery, by contrast, often required 10 to 15 minutes to coordinate a response. This was partly due to doctrine. German gunners were trained to fire deliberate, methodical shoots with ranging rounds and adjustments. It was accurate, but slow. The Americans had abandoned ranging shots entirely for time-on-target missions. Instead, they relied on surveyed gun positions and pre-calculated firing data. Every battery knew its exact location down to the meter, Every target was plotted with the same precision. The result was fire that arrived unannounced, unadjusted, and utterly overwhelming. And then there was the proximity fuse. Introduced in late 1944, the VT fuse, or variable time fuse, changed everything. Traditional artillery shells detonated on impact or after a timed delay. The proximity fuse used a miniature radar to detect the ground and detonate the shell automatically just before impact, showering the target area with shrapnel from above. Against troops in the open, the effect was catastrophic. Shells that would have buried themselves harmlessly in mud now exploded at the perfect height to maximize casualties. The Allies had developed the technology earlier in the war but kept it secret, fearing the Germans would reverse engineer it. By December 1944, with German forces on the defensive and the front lines far from any research facilities, the decision was made to deploy the fuse against ground targets. The timing couldn't have been better. The German offensive in the Ardennes was the largest they had launched since 1940, and it relied on massed infantry and armour moving through narrow roads and forest clearings, perfect targets for artillery. American commanders, caught off guard by the initial German breakthrough, responded with the one weapon they knew could stabilize the front. They called in everything: divisional artillery, corps artillery, separate battalions held in reserve, and they coordinated it all through time-on-target missions that turned German assembly areas into killing fields. For German officers trained in the methodical warfare of the Eastern Front, the experience was disorienting. They had learned to survive artillery by reading the battlefield. You listened for the first ranging shots. You watched where the shells landed. You moved before the barrage adjusted onto your position. But American time-on-target fire gave no warnings. No ranging shots, no adjustments. Just sudden, synchronized annihilation. One moment the forest was quiet, the next the sky split open. Hermann Mueller's company had crossed half the clearing when the world ended. There was no sound of incoming shells, no whistle, no scream, just a sudden, overwhelming roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The first shell landed 40 yards ahead, erupting in a fountain of frozen earth and steel fragments. The second landed 30 yards behind. The third, fourth, fifth, and 50th all landed within seconds, blanketing the entire clearing in a curtain of fire and shrapnel. Mueller's instinct was to run forward, but his legs refused. He dropped flat, pressing his face into the snow as the air above him turned to razors. The sound was beyond description. Not the rolling thunder of a Soviet barrage, but a single, sustained crack that seemed to fracture reality itself. Men screamed, but their voices were lost in the noise. Trees splintered. The ground heaved. Smoke and snow mixed into a choking fog that blinded and suffocated. When it stopped, the silence was worse. Mueller lifted his head. The clearing was no longer a clearing. It was a graveyard. Bodies lay scattered in the snow, some intact, others unrecognizable. The Panzer, at the tree line, was burning, its turret blown clean off. Survivors staggered in circles, dazed, bleeding, some clutching wounds they hadn't yet realized were fatal. Mueller tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. He looked down and saw blood spreading through the snow beneath him. Shrapnel. He couldn't feel it yet, but he knew. His company, 200 men who had crossed that clearing with the confidence of veterans, no longer existed as a fighting force. Half were dead, a quarter were dying. The rest were too shocked to function, and it had taken 90 seconds. Mueller lay back in the snow, staring at the grey sky. Somewhere, miles away, American gunners were already adjusting their aim, preparing the next volley. But Mueller wouldn't see it. His war was over. And as the cold seeped into his bones, a single thought echoed through his fading mind. We never had a chance. The German prisoners taken at Bastogne spoke in whispers when interrogators asked about American artillery. Some refused to speak at all, still trembling days after capture. Others described the bombardments with the vacant stare of men who had seen something their minds couldn't process. One captured sergeant, Klaus Zimmermann of the 2nd Panzer Division, gave testimony that American intelligence officers circulated throughout the European theatre. "We were advancing through a forest road," he said, voice flat and emotionless. "Column formation, good spacing. We had scouts ahead, security on the flanks, everything by doctrine. Then the forest exploded. Not gradually, not with warning shots. It just exploded. I was thrown into a ditch. When I looked up, the road was gone. The trees were gone. Half my company was gone. And we never heard the guns, never saw the flash, nothing. Just arrival. Another prisoner, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, an artillery officer himself, was more analytical but no less shaken. "I have commanded batteries on 3 fronts," he told his interrogators. "I understand. Artillery. I respect it. But what the Americans do is not artillery. It is something else. They do not suppress. They do not harass. They delete. You are there. Then you are not. There is no in-between." Weber's testimony revealed something deeper than fear. It revealed the collapse of professional confidence. He had spent his entire military career mastering the science of artillery fire. He knew how to calculate trajectories, adjust for wind, read terrain. He understood the rhythm of bombardment, ranging shots, corrections, fire for effect. But American time-on-target missions broke all those rules. There were no ranging shots to avoid, no adjustments to anticipate, no pattern to decode. Just overwhelming, instantaneous violence delivered with a precision that seemed impossible. Weber's final statement captured the psychological impact perfectly. "In Russia, we learned to survive artillery by being smarter, faster, more disciplined than the enemy. Against the Americans, none of that. It matters. You cannot outsmart mathematics." The statistics told a story that German commanders struggled to accept. In the fighting around Bastogne, American artillery fired over 10,000 rounds in an 8-hour period. Not scattered fire, not harassment. Coordinated, concentrated barrages directed by forward observers who moved with the infantry and called in fire missions with devastating accuracy. The 2nd Infantry Division, defending the northern shoulder of the Bulge near Dom Butgenbach, used artillery to hold positions that should have been overrun. When German armour and infantry attacked, American observers called in fire from divisional and corps batteries simultaneously. The result was a wall of steel that stopped entire battalions in their tracks. German after-action reports described fields littered with destroyed vehicles and bodies still in formation. One American artillery battalion commander, reviewing the results of a time-on-target mission, noted with clinical detachment that the target area looked like it had been ploughed, not destroyed, ploughed. The ground was so cratered and churned that it was difficult to walk across. The numbers revealed the scope of American fire superiority in stark detail. During a single day of fighting near Street, Vith on December 19th, the 116th Infantry Regiment called in 20 separate time-on-target missions. Each mission involved between 4 and 12 batteries firing simultaneously. The smallest mission delivered 72 rounds in under 5 seconds. The largest brought down over 300 shells in a single devastating volley. German units caught in these bombardments simply ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces. Radio intercepts captured the panic in German communications. Unit commanders reporting to division headquarters described not casualties or tactical setbacks, but complete obliteration. One intercepted transmission from a battalion commander near Hauffeleis consisted of 3 words repeated over and over. "They are gone. They are gone. They are gone." When German intelligence officers tried to reconstruct what had happened, they found no evidence of ground assault, no close air support, no armour engagement, just artillery. Perfectly timed, overwhelmingly concentrated artillery that had erased an entire battalion in the time it took to draw breath. The German army had sophisticated counter-battery doctrine, spotters trained to locate enemy guns by flash and sound, artillery units prepared to conduct counter-battery fire to suppress American guns. But American batteries were mobile, dug in, and rarely fired from the same position twice. By the time German counter-battery fire arrived, the American guns had already displaced to new positions. and because time-on-target missions required no ranging shots, German spotters had nothing to triangulate. The shells simply arrived, did their work, and the guns fell silent. It was like trying to fight ghosts. Some German units attempted tactical innovations to survive. The Führer Grenadier Brigade, an elite formation thrown into the battle near Bastogne, developed a technique they called the quick dispersion. When movement was necessary, units would advance in small teams separated by at least 100 yards, hoping that if American artillery struck, only a fraction of the force would be caught. It worked, occasionally, but it also meant that German units advanced at a crawl, their combat power diluted across miles of terrain. And American forward observers, watching through binoculars from hidden positions, simply called in multiple time-on-target missions, walking the fire across the dispersed formations until every group had been hit. The 945th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting operations in eastern France, became legendary for its execution of time-on-target missions. In November 1944, the battalion participated in a massive coordinated strike involving 17 corps battalions and 20 divisional battalions. Nearly 600 guns firing in perfect synchronization. The target was a German assembly area near the Metz fortifications, where an entire regiment was preparing for a counterattack. The fire mission lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, reconnaissance patrols advancing into the target area found the German regiment exactly where intelligence had reported it. Still in formation, still at assembly positions. All dead, not scattered, not fleeing, just gone. The patrol leader's report, filed matter-of-factly, noted that it appeared the regiment had been caught completely by surprise. There were no defensive positions, no evidence anyone had attempted to take cover. They had simply been standing in formation when over 3,000 shells arrived within a 10-second window. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victims. German soldiers in adjacent sectors heard the bombardment. They saw the smoke rising, and when they learned what had happened, when they understood that an entire regiment had been deleted in minutes, morale collapsed. Units that should have fought stubbornly began surrendering at the first sign of American artillery. Better to be a prisoner, they reasoned, than to be a coordinate on an American fire mission. The American forward observers themselves became figures of terror in German intelligence reports. These were not rear echelon soldiers calling in fire from safe positions. They were often young lieutenants or sergeants who moved with the frontline infantry, sometimes ahead of it, carrying radios and detailed maps. They lived in foxholes. They ate cold rations. They endured the same misery as the riflemen around them. But they wielded power that German soldiers found incomprehensible. A single American observer, with a radio and a clear line of sight, could bring down fire from guns positioned 20 miles away. He could coordinate strikes from batteries he had never seen, operated by crews he had never met, and he could do it in under 3 minutes. German snipers began targeting anyone carrying a radio with desperate priority. Capturing an American forward observer became a high-value objective because interrogations might reveal how the system worked. But even captured observers could only explain the mechanics. The radios, the grid coordinates, the firing tables. What they couldn't explain was the system's reliability, the fact that when you called for fire, it came. Always. Exactly when and where you requested it. That level of coordination required infrastructure, training, and trust that the German army, even at its height, had never achieved. One captured forward observer, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Chen, from the 28th Infantry Division, spent 3 days being interrogated by a German artillery major who simply could not accept Chen's explanations. "You are telling me," the major said, voice strained with disbelief, "that you, a lieutenant, can request fire from a corps artillery battalion, and they will comply without confirmation from higher command?" Chen, exhausted and hungry, simply nodded. "Within 3 minutes," he said. "Sometimes faster." The major sat back, shaking his head. "Then you have already won the war. You just do not know it yet." The effectiveness was so overwhelming that German units began developing new tactics specifically to avoid American artillery. They stopped using roads during daylight. They avoided open areas entirely. They moved only at night, in small groups, with maximum dispersion. But even those adaptations had limits. American forward observers were everywhere, hidden in church steeples, embedded with forward rifle companies, flying in light observation planes that circled behind German lines, calling in fire on anything that moved. And the American response time kept getting faster. By January 1945, some units were bringing fire down in under 90 seconds from the initial call. German soldiers began to speak of American artillery the way medieval armies spoke of plague, as something inescapable, something that killed without warning or mercy, a force of nature rather than a weapon of war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German military had always prided itself on technical excellence and tactical innovation, but American artillery represented something their doctrine couldn't counter. Industrial warfare at its purest, the Americans had taken the gun, the most traditional weapon of land warfare, and transformed it through organization, communication, and mass production into a killing system that operated with assembly line efficiency. German officers understood artillery. They understood tactics. What they couldn't understand was the American approach to war itself. The willingness to rely not on individual brilliance or battlefield heroism, but on systems so well designed that individual brilliance became unnecessary. An American artillery crew didn't need to be exceptional. They needed to be competent and follow procedures. The system did the rest. This was the same philosophy that built Liberty ships in weeks instead of months, that trained pilots in months instead of years, that turned farm boys into competent soldiers through repetitive drill and standardized doctrine. It was warfare as engineering problem, and the Germans, for all their tactical skill, had no answer to it. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945, German forces had suffered catastrophic losses, over 100,000 casualties, hundreds of tanks destroyed, and through it all, the constant, unrelenting pressure of American artillery. Every counterattack shattered by time-on-target missions, every assembly area turned into a killing zone, every attempt to concentrate forces met with coordinated fire from batteries the Germans could neither locate nor suppress. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, men who thought they had seen the worst war could offer, found themselves broken by an enemy they rarely saw. The Americans didn't need to engage in close combat if artillery could solve the problem first, and it almost always could. After the war, when American military historians interviewed German prisoners and captured officers, a consistent pattern emerged. The Germans respected American logistics. They marveled at American air power. But artillery? Artillery inspired something closer to existential dread. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorf, who served as Chief of Staff for the 7th Army during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote in his post-war memoirs about the American artillery arm with a tone that bordered on awe. In our artillery schools, we were taught that artillery is the king of battle. The Americans proved that doctrine correct, but they also proved that we had been playing chess while they were playing industrial production. Every position we tried to hold, they buried in steel. Every counterattack, they shattered before it began. We could not move without being seen. We could not concentrate without being destroyed. By the end, we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a machine that converted geography into mathematics and mathematics into death. Another captured officer, Oberst Hans von Luck, who commanded a Panzergrenadier regiment, was more blunt in his assessment. The Russian artillery would kill you if you were unlucky. The British artillery would kill you if you made a mistake. The American artillery would kill you. Period. That was the difference. There was no luck involved, no mistakes to avoid. You were simply in a grid square that had been designated for destruction, and destruction came. These weren't the bitter complaints of defeated men making excuses. They were professional assessments from officers trained to analyze battlefield performance. And their conclusion was unanimous. American artillery had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare. Not just effectiveness, but a level of systematic precision that turned killing into an industrial process. The Germans had always understood artillery as an art, skilled officers reading terrain, adjusting fire, commanding batteries with a combination of training and intuition. The Americans had turned it into an assembly line. Targets went in, coordinates came out, fire missions were executed with mechanical reliability, and the results were measured in grid squares cleared and enemy units destroyed. The story of time-on-target artillery extended beyond the Battle of the Bulge. It became the template for American fire support doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. But before the final campaigns began, the technique had already proven itself in smaller, more desperate battles that demonstrated just how devastating coordinated fire could be. On January 3, 1945, near the Belgian town of Chenogne, elements of the 11th Armoured Division found themselves facing a counterattack by veteran German units. The Americans were exhausted, their lines thin, their ammunition running low. A German battalion, approximately 600 men supported by armour, prepared to assault across an open field at dawn. The American company commander, Captain Robert Mitchell, had fewer than 150 men fit for combat. In previous wars, he would have been forced to retreat or fight a delaying action. Instead, he radioed his battalion fire support officer with a simple message. Enemy battalion forming up at grid coordinate Papa 472. Request immediate TOT. All available batteries. The response came back in 90 seconds. Fire mission approved. 10 batteries standing by. Time on target in 4 minutes. Mitchell's men didn't have to fire a shot. At precisely 06:15 hours, the German assembly area erupted in a storm of steel that lasted exactly 12 seconds. 400 shells landed within a 3-second window, followed by 2 more volleys timed at 4-second intervals. The entire sequence was over in less than 15 seconds. When the smoke cleared, the German battalion had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Survivors stumbled through the wreckage in shock. No organized resistance, no counterattack, just scattered, dazed men who had been transformed from an attacking force into casualties in the time it took to draw a breath. Mitchell's after-action report was clinical in its brevity. Enemy attack broken by artillery. No friendly casualties. Estimated enemy losses, 70%. Recommend immediate exploitation. That single engagement represented the evolution of American artillery doctrine to its ultimate form. Not just fire support, not just suppression, but a weapon system so responsive and so devastating that infantry units could call down annihilation on demand. The psychological impact on German units rippled across the entire front. Word spread through whispered conversations and panicked reports. The Americans could destroy entire battalions without infantry ever engaging. They could respond to threats in minutes, and there was no defense, no tactic, no amount of courage or skill that could survive the mathematics of coordinated fire. German commanders tried to adapt. They issued orders forbidding troops from concentrating in groups larger than platoon strength. They mandated dispersion, with units maintaining hundreds of yards between elements. They avoided predictable routes and assembly areas. But American forward observers were relentless. They called in fire on lone vehicles, on small groups of infantry, on supply dumps and command posts. The flexibility of the American system meant that no target was too small or too dispersed. If it could be seen, it could be destroyed. Oberst Wilhelm Werbig, commanding a Volksgrenadier regiment in the Eifel region, wrote in his diary about the impossibility of effective command under constant artillery threat. I cannot mass my forces without inviting destruction. I cannot disperse them without losing coordination. Every movement draws fire. Every position becomes a target. We are not fighting a battle. We are being systematically erased. His regiment, which had numbered nearly 3,000 men in December, was down to fewer than 800 by February, not from pitched battles or infantry assaults, but from the constant, grinding attrition of American artillery fire that found them wherever they tried to hide. The Americans had also refined their use of artillery observers to a degree that German units found incomprehensible. In traditional European warfare, artillery observers were specialists, officers trained in the precise art of directing fire. They operated from fixed observation posts with clear lines of sight and direct communication with their batteries. The American system was different. Every infantry platoon had soldiers trained in basic fire direction. Company commanders could call in artillery. Battalion officers could coordinate fire from multiple battalions. Even individual soldiers, if they had a radio and could read a map, could bring down fire missions. This decentralization meant that German forces were under observation constantly. An American patrol, encountering a German position, didn't need to attack. They called in coordinates and withdrew, while artillery did the work. German strong points that would have required costly infantry assaults were simply obliterated from miles away, and the speed of response meant that German units couldn't relocate between observation and impact. Lieutenant Werner Kluge, an artillery forward observer attached to the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, provided testimony after the war that revealed just how thoroughly American doctrine had inverted traditional artillery roles. In the German army, he explained, we prided ourselves on our artillery observers. They were artists, men who could read terrain and direct fire with precision. But the Americans treated observation like mass production. Everyone could do it. The quality of individual observers was lower, but it didn't matter. There were so many of them, and their system was so fast that they achieved better results through quantity and speed than we achieved through skill. This was the industrial warfare philosophy applied to human talent itself. Rather than rely on a small number of elite specialists, the Americans trained thousands of competent generalists and gave them a system so well designed that competence was sufficient. The result was an observation network so dense that German forces operated under the assumption they were always being watched. And that assumption, whether accurate or not, paralyzed tactical initiative. German officers became hesitant to commit reserves, fearing they would be destroyed en route. They delayed counterattacks, knowing that assembling forces invited artillery strikes. They avoided offensive action unless absolutely necessary, because every attack revealed positions and drew immediate, overwhelming fire. The German army, which had built its reputation on aggressive maneuver and tactical initiative, found itself reduced to static defense by an enemy that didn't need to see the battlefield to dominate it. The artillery observers flying in L-4 Grasshopper aircraft behind German lines represented another dimension of American dominance that German units struggled to counter. These small, slow observation planes were vulnerable to ground fire and could be shot down by any German fighter that spotted them. But American air superiority was so complete by 1945 that the Grasshoppers operated with near impunity. They flew low and slow over German positions, their pilots calling in coordinates with casual precision. From the air, German attempts at camouflage and dispersion were obvious. Vehicles hidden under trees, troops dug into hedgerows, supply depots covered with netting. The observers marked them all and radioed coordinates to fire direction centers that processed the information and assigned fire missions within minutes. Hauptmann Friedrich Hoffmann, who commanded a supply battalion in the Saar region, described the helplessness of operating under constant aerial observation. We moved only at night, he recalled. Every vehicle was camouflaged, every position was hidden, and still, the artillery found us. They would hit our supply dumps hours after we established them. They would catch our convoys on roads we thought were safe. We began to believe they could see through trees, through darkness, through our very thoughts. The truth was simpler but no less demoralizing. The Americans had observers everywhere, and they shared information instantly through a radio network that connected forward observers, artillery battalions, and corps headquarters in a web of communication that the German army, dependent on telephone lines and motorcycle couriers, couldn't match. The final evolution of American artillery dominance came with the systematic use of time-on-target missions against German artillery positions. Counter-battery fire had always been a part of artillery warfare, but the Americans approached it with characteristic thoroughness. When German guns fired, American sound-ranging equipment and flash-spotting teams would triangulate their positions within minutes. The coordinates would be transmitted to corps artillery, which would immediately plan a time-on-target mission using heavy 155mm guns. The result was that German artillery batteries, the moment they revealed their positions by firing, became targets for coordinated destruction. Crews learned to fire and displace immediately, abandoning their positions within minutes of shooting. But displacement took time, required trucks and coordination, and left guns vulnerable during movement. German artillery officers found themselves in an impossible situation. If they fired, they drew counter-battery fire. If they didn't fire, their infantry had no support. The American artillery system had created a form of dominance so complete that it suppressed not just enemy positions, but enemy capability itself. The story of time-on-target artillery extended beyond the Battle of the Bulge. It became the template for American fire support doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. In the final push across Germany, American artillery battalions routinely coordinated fire from 15, 20, even 30 separate batteries on single targets. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 began with a bombardment involving over 2,000 guns, not firing randomly, not saturating areas, firing in precise, coordinated volleys that suppressed German defensive positions with scientific thoroughness. German defenders, those who survived, described the bombardment as beyond anything they had experienced on any front. The Eastern Front had been hell, one survivor said. But at least in hell, you know the devil is coming for you. The Americans give no warning. You are alive, then you are not, and you never know why. The American Ninth Army's artillery preparation for the Rhine crossing was so thorough that General Eisenhower and General Simpson watched it from an observation post. More than 2,000 American guns opened fire simultaneously, their muzzle flashes visible along the horizon like a continuous lightning storm. The psychological impact on German defenders was instant and total. Entire battalions surrendered without firing a shot, not because they were cowards, but because they understood that resistance was mathematically futile. By war's end, American artillery had fired more than 27 million rounds in the prize. European theatre alone, not randomly, not wastefully. Each round part of a calculated, coordinated system designed to deliver maximum effect with minimum warning. The doctrine proved so effective that it became standard training for NATO forces during the Cold War and remained the foundation of American fire support tactics into the 21st century. But for the Germans who faced it in 1944 and 45, time-on-target artillery wasn't history or doctrine. It was the weapon that broke their army's faith in courage, skill, and experience. They had survived the Eastern Front. They had endured years of total war, but American artillery taught them a final, bitter lesson. That, in modern industrial warfare, individual bravery meant nothing against an enemy who could coordinate 400 guns to fire at exactly the same 3-second window. Hermann Mueller survived the war, barely. He spent 6 weeks in an American field hospital, then 8 months in a prisoner of war camp in Belgium. When he was finally repatriated to Germany in 1946, he returned to a country that no longer existed. His home city of Dresden was ash, his family scattered or dead. He worked as a labourer, then a clerk, then finally a schoolteacher in a small Bavarian town. He never spoke about the war to his students, but occasionally, on winter mornings when the sky was grey and still, he would pause during lessons and stare out the window. His students learned not to interrupt these moments. They didn't understand that their teacher was remembering a frozen clearing in Belgium, remembering the 90 seconds when the world exploded, remembering the lesson that ended his war and his faith. That courage cannot fight coordination, that discipline cannot defeat mathematics, and that the future of warfare belonged not to soldiers, but to systems. The clearing where Mueller's company died is quiet now. The snow that covered their bodies has melted and frozen 1,000 times. The trees have grown back. Farmers plant crops in soil enriched by ash and bone. Nothing marks the spot. No monument, no plaque. Just a field in Belgium that looks like any other. But beneath the surface, fragments remain. Shell casings, belt buckles, shattered bones. The archaeology of a moment when one army discovered it was fighting a war its doctrine could never win. The Americans didn't defeat the Germans through superior courage or tactical brilliance. They defeated them through superior systems, through radios and mathematics and obsessive standardization, through the willingness to treat war not as a test of martial virtue, but as an engineering problem with measurable solutions. Time-on-target artillery was the purest expression of that philosophy. Shells didn't care about courage. Trigonometry tables didn't respect tactical skill. The system worked because it was designed to work, practiced until failure was impossible, and executed with industrial precision. And 4. German soldiers trained in a tradition that valued individual excellence and tactical innovation that was the most terrifying thing of all. They weren't just losing battles, they were losing to a kind of warfare their entire military culture couldn't comprehend. By the time the war ended, American artillery doctrine had become the standard that every modern military tried to emulate. The Soviets studied it. The British adopted elements of it. The French and Germans, rebuilding their armies after the war, incorporated American fire direction techniques into their own doctrine. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, the side that could coordinate its firepower most effectively would win, not the side with the best soldiers or the finest tradition, the side with the best systems. Time-on-target artillery proved that lesson with devastating finality. And it did so not through some revolutionary new weapon, but through the systematic application of radios, mathematics, and meticulous training to a weapon as old as gunpowder itself. The gun had not changed. The artillery shell had not changed. What changed was the system that aimed them, coordinated them, and turned them from individual weapons into a single, overwhelming instrument of industrial destruction. That was the true innovation. And that was why, more than 80 years later, the story of time-on-target artillery remains a study in how wars are really won. Not through heroism, not through courage, but through organization, coordination, and the ruthless application of mathematical precision to the ancient art of killing. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.